Hey folks, welcome to The Artist Craft. I'm your host, Stacey Cochran, and we're thrilled to have in studio today at The Artist Craft Grammy-nominated record producer John Custer. Now, John has worked with bands like Corrosion of Conformity, Cry of Love, DAG, and most recently, Big Something. He lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, and joins us in studio today. Thanks so much for joining us, John.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk today about music, about your career as a producer and as a musician. So let's start. What is the very earliest memory that you have of hearing rock and roll?
Hearing rock and roll, probably hearing rock and roll came with seeing an album cover. Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. There was this girl covered in whipped cream, and I had to hear that record. And it turns out it was Herb Alpert, so it was quite good. And my mother bought a lot of the early A&M stuff, Sergio Mendes and the Brazil 66 and all that stuff. So I was lucky that I had a mother that had good taste in music. So there was music in the house constantly. She was one of those girls that went out and bought albums and instead of, I don't know what the other women were buying, but
that was her thing.
Yeah, it was her thing, yeah.
So when did you first begin to play music seriously, would you say?
When I was in third grade, I wrote some songs. They're very good, big hooks. But I decided to put a show on in my neighborhood for some of the other kids and all that kind of thing. I took it way too seriously, you know, flash pots, things like that. Bombs. But no, it was really one of those situations where, you know, you kind of get a little taste of what it's like to play. Mm-hmm. In sixth grade, this girl wrote a poem, and my teacher asked me to write music to it. And I did, and we played it for the school, and they went nuts, you know, like an entire auditorium of kids screaming and yelling. I thought I was David Cassidy, you know. So that's the way that goes. You know, you get a little taste of it like that, and then you realize that not only do you like the creative process, but the benefits are.
So what did you play early on, say in those, you know, those early adolescent years? Were you playing the guitar at that point?
Yeah, I'd steal my dad's guitar away. He had one of those now coveted Sears Silvertone guitars, the scaled down black thing that would probably be worth a fortune now. But yeah, I got his guitar, I showed a natural acuity for it, and he encouraged me. And anytime I tried to slack off on my practicing, my mother would grab the guitar away from me and keep it for a week. And she'd say, "You can have it back when you stop messing around."
Huh.
Yeah.
So what was your first guitar?
My first real guitar was something I had to buy myself from the Sears surplus store. And it was, technically it was a guitar. It was wood and there were strings on it. So, you know, the action was horrible. In a way, it was a big favor because I had to struggle so much that when I got a real guitar, it played like, you know, so effortlessly compared to the plank of wood that I had before that.
Some strings and magnet coils wrapped on it, and they called it a guitar. I know what that kind is like, no doubt about it. So it sounds like you were taking lessons, or were you primarily self-taught?
I was self-taught. I tried to go to this incredibly bad idea. It was a community guitar lesson, like 15 people in a room learning from one teacher.
Wow.
Yeah. So, you know, it's like teaching Bigfoot to cook or something. It was terrible. So I didn't learn anything. I'd come home, you know, I was tiny, and the people with larger hands were learning and I wasn't. So I decided to come home and I worked out a system where I played the bottom 4 strings because I could get to those with my little hands. But, you know, secretly I've always wanted to go back to that room and teach them a lesson.
Yeah, now that you've
I think.
Now that you've, been Grammy nominated.
Yeah, how you like me now, yeah.
So in the early part of your career, you were working in New York as a session guitarist for TV ads like VH1, Ford, Mazda, Revlon, and Coca-Cola. How did you first get your foot in the door, in that industry?
That was a vicious thing. I made a tape of all this guitar work that I had done. That was mostly, blistering, you could tell right away that I could play the kind of guitar that those guys liked. And it was cutthroat. They put me in a studio with an amp, and across the hall there was, I think, Eddie Martinez, I think, was this other guitar player, played with Robert Palmer and some people like that. And they would say, burn it up, So you just tear up a guitar as much as you could. And the guy who owned the studio would walk down the hall. And if he looked in the window, that meant he was interested, and that meant you got the next ad campaign. So that's what it was. You had to literally gun down the other guitar players. And, I was hungry. And so it was a good experience. I saw things during my apprenticeship there that really educated me completely about how cruel that business is. It was a good education.
Do you have a specific story that you remember?
It's a very unpleasant story. There was a guy who was a very famous percussionist. He played on probably every record you and I know. And he had cancer. He used to have long flowing hair and everything. But he'd gone through his chemotherapy, and he was bald, and he was coming in. His prognosis was still not good. And he came into the studio, and they all met him at the door. They hugged him and everything, and he came in and he played his parts. And when he was done, he left. They hugged him again. Take care of yourself and keep fighting. And when he left, the people there in the studio from the law department said, hey, if he dies, we don't have to pay him.
Wow.
That's how I learned about.
So what does that tell you? And what does that teach you? And what are some of the things as a producer you kind of learn from that then?
Well, that's why I kind of got into it, because there are commodity-driven people, obviously, in every business. But in this business, they were preying on artists, and if you have an equivalent for an artist, like if you look at every single artist as Jeff Buckley or John Lennon or something like that, and you imagine them doing something like that to one of those guys, naturally as an artist you fight for them because they're brethren. You know how hard artistic process is and what they have to go through. So there's a long tradition of musicians who are producers. And I wanted to be a producer that kind of stuck up for the musicians in the studio and make sure the records got made the way they should.
How do you think, coming from being a musician yourself, that informs how you treat or how you interact with other musicians? In some of your productions, do you work with the bands actually musically playing the guitar? And I guess you're able to connect with them on that level, like you're saying.
Yeah, the trick to producing that way is that you care about someone else's music as much as they do. And when you can articulate that to whoever it is that had the original intent behind the work, then they really appreciate that, and you get a better final product that way.
So your first major project was producing Corrosion of Conformities, a groundbreaking blind album. How did you first come to know COC, and how did this project take shape? I mean, how did you end up in a producer's role?
Well, I just started making recordings at my house, and on a little tiny cassette format recorder. But people thought that my recordings were done in a big studio. It wasn't a fidelity issue. It was just that there was a scope to my recordings, and they were informed because I knew how to get musicians in a good headspace so they did well, did good takes. And that's how being a musician helps you in that role. And then more and more and more people heard these recordings. Well, then I switched over to another studio, a big studio, and those recordings started to get around. So, you know, eventually someone's going to call. That's what happened.
Well, the guest is John Custer. He's a Grammy-nominated record producer and musician. He's worked with Corrosion of Conformity, Cry of Love, DAG, and Big Something most recently. So it was originally, the album that you did with Corrosion of Conformity, Blind, was originally released on Relativity Records in '91.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get started at Relativity? How did you get your foot in the door there?
They got their foot in the door there. The record label wanted some kind of, I forget who the producer was that they wanted for that, but the band wanted me to work with them, and they fought for me to be their producer. Mainly because they did not want template production at the time. A lot of the, as metal records tend to do, they all sound the same, right? And they wanted to make a record with a diversity from track to track. And they wanted to retain their punk rock credibility and that kind of visceral nature of the band before, but kind of transition into this bigger arena, Black Sabbath style stuff. And it was a tall order, so they knew they had to have a soldier, not, you know, not somebody who's just going to do it and make the bucks.
So what did you do? How did you work with them to conceive of the album? Because it was a very different sound than their first two independent releases.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we made sure we were in the exact same mindset, that everybody was on the same page. And then, you know, we did things in the studio that were, now it wouldn't seem like a big deal, but they hadn't been done before and applied to music, which was transitioning at the time. So if you listen to the beginning of the record, there's I think maybe 20 guitars just chugging, and then this feedback kind of garden begins, right? 24 tracks of feedback that make this polychord. And the way we did that was I made the guitar player strike the chord, stand on a chair, and lift his guitar to the giant speakers on the wall, kind of like an altar or something. And this magic feedback happened, right? And with each event like that, the band got more and more daring, and the project took on a dark nature that translated to the listeners who appreciated how different it was.
So after that, as you're beginning to conceive of albums, do you start with a theme in mind? I mean, how are you just producing music that they've done live?
It's different for every band, of course, but if you come up with a scenario, like there's a football field and it's full of newborn babies. Busting through the bleachers is a T-Rex, starts devouring the babies, right? That conjures up a reaction in most people, right? You just had a baby,
sure,
right? So you're thinking, right? But this is the same kind of thing that happens to you if you listen to the first two Black Sabbath records. There's the menace of death, cemetery, dark, right? And if you can articulate ideas like that to creative people, they'll say that's it, right? You have to convince someone that you see something as vividly as they do, and then you go forward.
So in that example, you know, the idea is you start with an actual visual image and let that image kind of guide the sound then.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So how long did Blind take to produce?
It was a hellish experience. We didn't have that much of a budget, so we were staying in friends' apartments. I was staying in an apartment that had crucifixes all over the wall wrapped in barbed wire. So this guy was obsessed with serial killers and everything.
Talk about visual images that form your theme.
But I do think it served, I think it served the process And I think we worked on that record for a little over 2 months. Yeah.
Is that typical?
That's fast,
Seems
you
kinda
know.
fast.
It's fast, but it's fast because it had to be fast. We had to come in, you know, under budget.
So its success played a part in Corrosion of Conformities signing with Columbia Records. What was the experience like signing with Columbia?
That experience would be a month-long party that I don't remember much of, but it was great. You know, that band deserved to be on that label from the beginning, so we were happy. Fruition, it's great.
And the track Drowning in a Daydream from their Wise Blood album was the track that you were nominated for a Grammy Award as producer. Do you remember how you first heard the news?
I do. I couldn't discern it. There was I was in Atlanta, and the woman at the front desk had a speech impediment, and I came in, and she said, something in your Grammy, which I thought she was saying there's a message from my grandmother or something like that. So 3 days go by, and she's smiling, big smile. I couldn't understand. So finally somebody called me and told me about it, that the track had been nominated. So, you know, what that translates to mostly something you can tell your mother and she'll be proud of, because she recognizes the term Grammy, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, the other things, you know, I was far more impressed with the records that charted #1 and were listened to and requested all over the country, because that means you're actually getting out to a listenership. But the Grammy nomination seems to be the thing.
Career-wise, what does that do at that point? You're still pretty young, you know, it's huge.
Yeah, it's good. It was good. You never get to celebrate any of those things really, because you're on to the next project and you've got new problems, right? So when you hear it, it's nice, and, you know, champagne at dinner or whatever kind of thing. But, you know, in the entire 90s, I don't think I was home, so I didn't have a chance to really take any of it in.
It does seem like you were definitely on a roll by that point. The album's name comes from a Flannery O'Connor novel. Was that by design? And if so, what does the novel mean to you?
That's Pepper. Pepper named that record Wise Blood, and I think he was reading it at the time, but I don't know. He, that's his thing.
So tell us how you came to work with Cry of Love.
Cry of Love is, it was one of those bands that had so much talent in it, and I thought the real shame that I realized coming back from New York was that a lot of really great artists aren't really ever going to get to record, because only the people that could afford to record were recording, or had access to a good producer and that kind of thing. So all of these artistic equations were going to stay right where they were. So I decided I was going to find people who were just bowled me over as musicians, and put together a project with them, and not charge them, do it on spec, and then rely on my good judgment that if I work with these people, it will get signed at some point, you know, later on, and it did. So we worked on that project for 3 years, and finally one day it got signed. They got on to Columbia.
And in 1993, Peace Pipe off the Brother album hit #1 on the Billboard Mainstream Rock Chart, and Bad Thing hit #2, which you co-wrote. You're definitely on a roll at that point.
Yeah, sure. And again, it was one of those things where you're so busy with everything else that you don't really get a chance to acknowledge it that much. But we had worked on the Cry of Love project for, I think that started in 1989. So it was a long time coming. So that was more like a sigh of relief than anything else.
It was a bit of a relief. Still something to be very proud of. So tell us about songwriting. Big question. What is the essence of good songwriting?
In the sense that you have an amazing vocalist, if you can write a song that showcases the vocal idiosyncrasies and really it's one or the other. You've got a vocalist that knows how to choose good material, or you have a songwriter who writes for a great vocalist. And so that's what I've always tried to do when I write. I have somebody in mind, and I write with their voice in mind and try to bring out those qualities that I like to hear as much as possible.
So what are you looking for as a producer when you hear a new band or musician?
Talent, just talent, more than anything else, you know. You're never going to get everything, you know, I know that. You're never going to get talented kids who don't do drugs and have an amazing work ethic and so on. So of all those things that you would want, I look for talent. The stable of people that I work with are all deliriously talented. And that's what drives me, because I'm constantly inspiring them by recognizing it, and they're constantly inspiring me by being so talented.
So where do you hear new music now?
I hear it a lot online, you know. I mean, I have to go listen like everybody else. If there's somebody in town and somebody calls me and tells me about it, then I go listen. But for the most part, when the music business collapsed, all of that methodology, the way you used to do things, just exploded. You know, you don't really, there aren't showcases anymore, and everything seems to be sort of karaoke and American Idol oriented. So you get people that can sing okay, but they don't have anything else that's exemplary. Then you're left with this woman who would be fine in the church choir, but she's as far from Kate Bush or David Bowie, or you know, there's nothing else there. So you look for talent, and you look for them to be, you know, someone from the counterculture that's truly existentialist and does their own thing, no matter how many people try to fire it down and break them down. You know, they stick to it. That's what I look for.
Who's a couple of people like that you've had the pleasure to work with?
I guess there was Chris Whitley, was this guitar player that I worked with, who was, in the truest sense, he was probably the most, I guess, legitimate artist that I've ever known. He lived it every moment. And the same can be said for a great singer-songwriter that I worked with named Nathan Davis. He was, every day, all day long, he was a songwriter and a musician. It was never like he was a tourist. And there are some young people coming up that I'm working with right now, developing, that you see that spark, that they could become that.
How has the internet changed how albums are produced?
They're intangible. Album artwork is sort of just negated now. There's no real sense of an album with a theme where you listen to the whole thing. Probably a good example would be The Wall by Pink Floyd. That's gone. Now it's just track by track. The worst thing is that people are promoting their music by doing outrageous things that have nothing to do with music. You know, these YouTube videos that grow into some sort of auto-tune sensation and all that stuff. That's in the days of old, you know, those were just curiosity tracks. They were jokes, you know, and now they're the mainstay. And you've got people who, I guess, Lady Gaga could be considered some sort of retooling of Madonna. That's fine, you know, Madonna's fine, but she shouldn't be considered the ultimate artist out today. I mean, she's good, but she's nothing to moan over when you consider any of the work of the Beatles or any of those bands. Lady Gaga looks like she's been running around her house without her helmet on. You know, just kind of a dizzy girl.
So tell us a little bit about working with somebody who was authentic like Nathan Davis. How did you first become aware of his talent, and what was the occasion that led you to work with Nathan?
Somebody told me about Nathan Davis, and I met with him, and we just talked, and you can't really tell much from that. I liked him, and we went in the studio, and we started recording, and he played the first song, and I thought, that's a hell of a song, you know. And so then he said, all right, let's go on to the next song. Next song was better, and the next song was better. And so I just stopped the session, and I said, you know, we've got to fire your whole band right now. Get better players in here and do this again. And that started a better relationship. And we played together. His equation, it doubled and redoubled and redoubled. He grew so quickly. By the time he passed away, I don't know, I think he was well on his way to becoming truly significant worldwide. I think the music that he left behind after his death, it has a chance of becoming significant. I think it's going to get attached to a movie or something, and people will become aware of him because he was that good.
Who do you liken his voice to, in your mind? Who does he sound like?
He sounded like Jackson Browne sometimes, you know, which he would just shrug his shoulders and, what? But he sounded like a lot of people sometimes, but it was just, he was such a good singer. You always thought of other great singers when you heard him sing.
We're down to about our last minute here. What advice would you give to an aspiring singer-songwriter? And then what advice would you give to somebody who wants to produce music?
If you're an aspiring singer and songwriter, work on it constantly and find people who are intelligent that are going to give you good feedback, constructive criticism. Leave your pride at home when people offer up criticism of your work. Find your weak points and get rid of them, and take your strong points all the way down the road. As far as a producer, you've just got to record and record and record and work on what kind of producer you're going to be, what you're going to offer the people that you work with. Are you going to be a technical producer, or are you going to be like me? I conjure an atmosphere, a situation where artists thrive. So yeah, you just have to decide what you're going to do and do it.
Very cool. We're just about out of time for today. For all of us here at the Artist Craft, I want to thank you guys for tuning in, and Michael and Marnie working hard in the back. John, thanks so much for joining us in studio today.
Sure, pleasure.
So we'll roll credits, and it does fly by.